I'm Michael Matos from the Collection Development Office, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stephanie Smith. And we are going to be talking with you this afternoon about the library's multi-year project to do an assessment of its general collections. Stephanie is driving the slide, so I just have to say next slide. So I will be doing the sort of background part and talk a little bit about collecting policy. So I'm going to kind of, since we do have a short period of time, I'm going to try to sprint through that information and give more time to Stephanie to talk about the project itself and some of our initial findings and next phases. Next slide. So to frame this all, the Library of Congress has as its mission statement to engage, inspire, inform Congress and the American people with a universal and enduring source of knowledge and creativity. Next slide. To support that mission to build a national collection, the library has service units within its larger subgroup of the Library Collections and Services Group, the Law Library and Library Services. Stephanie and I are part of Library Services, and that is the largest service unit in the library. There's a lot of other people in the library doing really important work, like the Copyright Office. But when we talk about the collection and we talk about the library with reading rooms, with reference, it's Library Services. And there's around 1,400 staff in Library Services for building that collection and recommending materials. We have around 200 subject specialists, and to acquire and work on the intellectual access to that material, the cataloging. We have around 440 staff, both based in DC and within our overseas operations offices in areas of the world where there isn't an established book trade or materials are just very difficult to get. Next slide. So let's kind of look at this inflow of material. And the one thing to say is for general collections, it could come from any slice of this pie. It could be a gift, it could be a purchase, it could be through copyright, government transfer, exchange, what have you. It's important to note that these are counting individual items. So the 5 million items there, if it's manuscript material, it's 5 billion pages. If it's books, it's 5 million, it's so many volumes. It's not whole works or whole collections. So purchase is a small component here. So directing acquisition in terms of with intent to seek out material and acquire it is only 23% of what the library has available to it. A lot of this material comes through copyright registration, mandatory deposit, or gift. And so we have to be cognizant of what we have available to us, and what has built a collection over the decades is in part coming through this non-purchase means. Also, just to note that the overseas operations offices, which are also available to you all as librarians as well as a vendor, do a tremendous work in areas of the world where it is very difficult to acquire materials. And that kind of helps add to the diversity of our collections beyond what we receive through copyright deposit with the US materials. Next slide, please. So if we talk about what comprises the 170 million items, and to be clear, that's 170 million physical items. This does not include our digital collections, which are still being tabulated. We cover every subject area except clinical medicine and mechanical agriculture. Those are covered by our sister national libraries, the Library of Medicine, National Library of Medicine, and National Agricultural Library. We are the de facto national library, meaning that no one has ever written, Congress has not chartered us to be the actual national library of the US. No one else is doing it, so we're going to do it. This presents itself a little bit of a challenge since it is not written into our mandate. At times it can be a challenge. Everyone in the library that I've ever spoken to and involved with is very committed to building a expansive collection that is representative of all facets of at least American life and Americana, but at times competing interests can challenge how the materials that we acquire. So when we're talking about general collections, this assessment, we're only talking about the 15% at the bottom of that pie chart, the total classified collections. And in the next slide, we'll see kind of what that is. Most of it is non-purchase material. A lot of it's going to come through copyright. About 70 to 80% of the materials received overall in the library annually are coming from the US. It fluctuates year in and year out due to budgets and other things. So 30 to 20% on average is going to be through foreign materials, probably, or international materials acquired, probably through purchase. We really will only use purchase when we can't use other means of for acquisition. And the general collections physically are 23 million books and bound serials in Western languages, including Greek and the Cyrillic alphabet, and they're materials that are not assigned to a custodial division. And that's an important caveat, because within, say, the European division, they are custodial of some Russian serials, specifically newspapers, that are outside of the general collections. But in general, without using the word general too many times, the materials for Russian are mostly in the general collections. Next slide. So that's what we have. This is, you can kind of see what's coming in. You can see it's all big numbers. So what is the framing structure around this? And in 1940, then Librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish, who was a poet, articulated three facets of that it said what the library should be collecting. They're called the canons of selection. They can be summarized as: we will acquire anything Congress and the government needs to do its work. Number two is, we want to have a comprehensive collection that records the life and achievement of the American people. And facet three, we want an expansive collection of materials that reflect, that document past societies and countries of the world that are of interest to the American people. So that's a poet's take on what the Library of Congress should do, and it's articulate enough that we still use it today. But obviously we're a bureaucracy, so we need bureaucratic documents to bring that into something that's actionable. And those are our collection policy statements. We have over 70. These are similar to what you'll see at a research library. Probably most of your institutions have your own collection policy statements. Most of ours are subject-based, and there'll be themes like religion, history, chemistry, things that we're all very familiar with. But we'll also have format-specific ones like government publications, sound recordings, web archiving, so things that are a little bit more specific to niche things that the library collects a lot of material around and has a need for. The documents, I feel like at other institutions I've worked at, are kind of things that kind of you hang on the wall and you bring out when someone brings a bag of books in. They say, "Oh no, we can't have those. I'm sorry, those are out of scope for our document." But the collection managers kind of go on their own and build the collection, working with the faculty and the students and such. But at LC, we're so large that we kind of need this document as a foundational principle around collecting, because we have our normal collection development recommending officer to acquisitions, technical services relationship, but then there's a parallel acquisition stream through copyright. And it's just important that everyone is on the same page about the collecting. And so that's where these documents have a much more day-to-day importance than I've seen at other institutions. Next slide. And to kind of get a little bit more into it, we have them broken down by LC classification. So each one will have call number ranges associated with it. We use an adaptation of RLG's conspectus method, which probably many of you are familiar with, but we're ranking things from 5 to 0, 5 being comprehensive collecting and 0 being out of scope. The challenge for us and for this assessment is that the RLG is all geared towards supporting doctoral research, supporting faculty research, or just having introductory materials. It's all dealing with this research environment that's about matriculating through a program and getting a degree, whereas then this leads itself to having a conversation about, well, what is the diversity of the materials that you're collecting? We end up having this bias towards scholarly, what is defined as authoritative or appropriate material. And to articulate that within our collection policy statement for religion, I kind of brought out this one area. So Christianity, we collected a 4, which in conspectus is doctoral, not comprehensive, but you can at least support independent doctoral research on the topic. But within that, we've denoted devotional works and tracts, and those are defined as a 2, which is basic introduction, which conspectus says is an encyclopedia or a dictionary, maybe 1 or 2 periodicals. And that doesn't really accurately reflect what we are interested in around devotional works. Yes, if someone creates an encyclopedia of tracts, we'll definitely get a copy of it, but mostly we want the actual tracts themselves, and we want the self-published devotional works. So that is one of the challenges that we're looking at within these statements and trying to understand how they're affecting the collecting. Next slide. Which brings us to diversity. The library's been concerned about the comprehensiveness of its collection since the Copyright Act. At that point, then Librarian of Congress, Spotworth. I know his last name is Spotworth, but it's an unusual first name. So Spotworth was like, oh my gosh, this is great. They're going to centralize copyright in the library. I can now comprehensively collect Americana. And that's what they did. And then within a few years, they ran out of space and they started selecting things. And that's when obviously we get into the world we are in today. We're not following, again, the same mandate as a research library, as a traditional research or academic library. We are trying to create that comprehensive, expansive historical record of American creativity and U.S. publishing. We're also very interested in international publishing as well. And so when we look at material, we're trying to be inclusive as best as we can of all viewpoints, experiences, and authorship. And so for this assessment, it's really about, are we meeting that mandate? Are we examining authorship and other factors for what's acquired in the library? And to the best of our ability, Stephanie and I have been working on methods to try to benchmark against what's available versus what was actually retained within the collection. Next slide. So inclusivity. Inclusiveness is, again, another popular term within library land these days. The Library of Congress is not an inclusive collector of anything. If you've been told at some point in your life that the Library of Congress has a copy of every book published, we don't. We don't get a lot of material. A lot of material today is published, self-published, and we really get very little self-published material in the Library of Congress. To understand how selection happens is at some level very simple, and at the same time extremely complicated, as one would expect with the government. So we're not interested so much in isolating specific viewpoints or types of authorship in selection, but there is some measure of certain things. If 100 things come in copyright on average, about 80 or 70 things will be retained. So some of it is being excluded, and that can be for a variety of reasons. Often it deals with physical characteristics of the works, duplication, pagination, quality of binding, but there's also measures of quality where there's a higher level of scrutiny, and this again goes down to something like self-published material, which is examined at a much higher level, and the library collects a very selective representative sample of self-published materials. And there is an open question if these selection criteria that we're using and prioritizing traditional publishing over emerging publishing methods is inadvertently impacting the composition of the library's collections. So these are the things that Stephanie and I were really focused on and have been working at. And now to talk about the project, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Michael, and I think I'm unmuted here. So I'll be talking about the project activities that are kind of sprouting up out of this conversation we've been having that Michael has gone over. There we go. So I'll talk a bit about the project goals here quickly. With assessing the general collections, we're looking to see that the library is meeting its goal of meeting the library's collecting mandate. So we're trying to assess our effectiveness at that. We want to provide action steps to address any issues we might identify through those assessments, and we want to build this as a data gathering process to support ongoing and future assessment. Assessment is a good chunk of our office, collection development office's work, and so this is something we kind of want to build into a process. Michael called this a multi-year project, and it is, but this would go ideally even beyond that to just kind of become like a maintenance project we have within the library. So the project scope, as Michael has outlined, is the 23 million general collections items. So we're trying to kind of look at publishing from all countries that we're actively collecting from. We're looking both retrospectively at acquired materials that are already in the general collections, but we're also looking at the current and future inflow of materials. So both the retrospective collected things and what's current and in the future. So our initial work and assessments are already underway. We are framing a lot of our assessment work around the collections policy statements that Michael outlined earlier. So we began a pilot on one CPS last summer, and we're looking at things like the collecting levels in those CPSs and comparing those against our holdings and against external metrics of publishing output as we can determine those. So looking at, okay, we call our collecting in this area 4. Do we really think it's a 4 based on what we have and what we think was out there retrospectively, what is out there now? The diversity of the holdings in terms of the attributes that are easily identifiable in ILS data is something we're also interested in. Things like publishers, place of publication, age of the works, the LC subclass. Again, things that are identifiable in ILS data because that's how this pilot is starting out at first. Right now, we're looking at ILS data only. And that pilot that we're working on is on our fine and decorative arts CPS. So if you see me talking about data and graphs and charts and things later, that's all in relation to this fine and decorative arts subject area. We did form a working group this fall. We have asked them to kind of join together in a group to consult with us and advise Michael and I on potential additional assessments and reporting. So this is it's a big project. It's a big collection to look at. There are many different directions this could go, and Michael and I don't want to be the only two people deciding how it's all going to play out. So we're asking them to advise us, and I'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. So with the pilot underway, the working group is forming. In the winter, we're starting an in-depth analysis of that collection material inflow. So kind of moving beyond what we're looking at that we already have and looking at the inflow. So the Copyright Office and our acquisitions arm, the Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access Directorate, they already collect statistics on this kind of thing. So we're hoping to use that and build on that to look at what is incoming and what's available. And we're hoping to kind of look at that data in a similar way, looking at similar fields, as I mentioned just a moment ago, looking at publisher, place of publication, perhaps going down to the city level when possible, subject area, that kind of thing. The working group is comprised of recommending officers, so those employees that are responsible for kind of selecting and building the collections, and they are from divisions within the international and the General and International Collections Directorate, I should say. So they have members from the Researcher and Reference Services Division. They are tied to our main reading room, and that is our humanities and social sciences kind of arm of recommending and reference. We have a representative from the Science, Technology, and Business Division, representatives from 2 of our international collections divisions, so which are named the Hispanic Division and the European Division. Much of their materials is part of the general collections. And then we have the 2 collection development librarians, Michael and myself, are on the group, kind of taking a lot of information and advice from these members. We are also planning to add representatives from the African and Middle Eastern Division and the Asian Division, which are the 2 other kind of international materials area studies, as we often call them, divisions in that directorate. Much of their material actually falls outside of the general collections because of the language. Again, with general collections, it's mostly Western languages. So a lot of their material isn't included, but some of the material is, and we want those folks from those divisions to kind of help us out with the working group as well. So some of the initial outcomes we've had from the working group and talking with them, they're interested in a few initiatives like assessing the collections in terms of publishing on the subnational level, like cities represented, number of publishers, languages, etc. They're interested in determining authorship of the materials. Who is writing these materials? Are we getting a wide representative sample of authorship? They're also interested in determining the range and amount of titles that are represented within an LC subclass, some kind of basic information there. And they're interested in connecting our ILS data with external sources to evaluate the diversity and comprehensiveness of the library's collections. So again, we're getting to that kind of that balance of what we have versus what is potentially available in the universe of publishing. Some other areas they're interested in, perhaps concerns we could call them, looking at vendor offerings. So perhaps conducting a review of the offerings from an approval plan vendor, looking at the lists they supply or the items they send us, and when possible, the material that we aren't receiving on lists or not receiving or selecting at the library. So the hope there is kind of to determine if they're able to provide us with a diverse range of authors, creators, places of publication. And I should note here that with the vendors that we talk about here, approval plan vendors, the majority of them are international vendors from outside the US. With the publisher comparison, it's kind of a similar thing that they would be interested in. You know, publishers may be restrictive in what they publish in terms of viewpoints or authors, or they may be founded for or become known for seeking out works by authors who are part of groups that are generally underrepresented in mainstream publishing. So that's something we're kind of looking into examining, looking at publisher lists and comparing our collections against theirs. And then kind of looking at the self-published universe is something our working group is interested in as well. You know, if we are more highly selective when we're considering self-published material for the library, is that kind of detrimental? Are we missing materials that would be of interest or value? So I'll go over some quick initial findings, again, with just the ILS data, just the information you can glean from that for fine and decorative arts. So here is just a quick map of the subclasses involved, the subclasses that we define in that collections policy statement. Most of them are the N subclasses here. We do have some sub-ranges in the T's and the G's, but most of this is going to be the N's, as you might expect. Looking at decade of publication, of course, a lot of the material that we are counting here in this data is published relatively recently. You see it start to ramp up more in 1870 when we had that, when the Copyright Act was passed. And then again in the 60s, 70s, it ramps up again. When we're thinking about language and subclass, kind of looking at how the main languages, the top 10 or 15 so languages are distributed across the relevant subclasses. That biggest section there that you see, the dark blue section, is English, and it's not a big surprise that's the majority of many of the collections. Generally, the next largest languages are French, German, and Italian, with a little bit of variation depending on the field, the subclass with the other languages. When we think about continent or region, much of the collection is published in Europe or in North America, in the United States. And then you see represented, the numbers kind of shrink down from there for the other continents or regions that we have here. If you kind of think about starting to drill down a little bit into those continents or regions, we have a small sample here of trying to look at things at the place of publication at the city level. So this is just a sample, but if we think about the continents and regions that we've defined here, we look at the country from that region with the most publications in our collections. And then we look at the major publication centers in those countries. We're trying to see how much of the publications in our collections from a given country are published outside the major publication centers, maybe. Kind of trying to look at where the material we collect is coming from, and if it's distributed across a given country, or if it's really consolidated in one place, which could be happening for many reasons. But for example, we have South Africa and Cuba here. A lot of their material is more centralized in one or a few cities. Some of the other countries here are a little bit more distributed. Germany, Australia, the US, the percent of material in our collections is in the 30s in terms of what is coming from one of the major publication centers. So that's just something we're kind of interested in looking at, seeing that distribution. If we also think about non-English language materials in the USA, kind of flipping that a bit and looking at the US and languages here, it's very low in terms of non-English languages. Across all of the subclasses, it's only, it's under 1%. So we're kind of interested in examining that more. It may be that for art in the US, that material is generally mostly published in English. Something we'd like to look into more now that we have this in front of us. So that's kind of a very quick run through of some of our initial findings. I'll talk a bit about our next plans in this multi-year project here. So we are still considering some further assessments that we're discussing with the working group. We would like to survey the other recommending officers across the library, those 200 plus folks that are selecting materials for collecting in the library, asking them, working with them to see how they consider diverse viewpoints, experiences, identities when they're recommending materials. We're also interested in doing comparisons, more comparisons. So comparing against bibliographies, maybe lists that are including, depending on the subject area, we might be looking at lists of material authored by people of diverse viewpoints, values, experiences, and similarly kind of looking at a peer comparison perhaps with research institutions that may be strong in a given CPS assessment area, kind of comparing our collections against theirs and seeing if there are potential gaps in what they have versus what we have. So kind of in conclusion, it's a big project that we're working on. We're trying to see if we're meeting this mandate to have a diverse and inclusive collection. We do collect expansively across formats, languages, and countries. And here we're just kind of narrowing this to a small slice of that in the general collections. We do envision this as expanding beyond those general collections, kind of expanding into the area studies materials that fall outside of general collections and including special collections, which would need its own adaptations in terms of assessments, because it's just a different thing when you're assessing special collections, of course. But this is our starting point. We're working with general collections materials first, and kind of looking forward to the future and expanding that in the future. So thank you for joining us. I think we have a short bit of time left if there are questions.
There was one question in the chat. Do you receive gifts from the general public?
Yes.
We do. Yep. And it can range from someone bringing books into a reading room, or if we're contacted from a member of the general public with a significant collection. Yes. So.
Yeah, I mean, it could be anything from like Stephanie said, it could be just someone walking in off the street with a bag of books, just like you would have it at any other public or academic library, or it's Carl Sagan saying, "I'd like to give you my stuff." Looks like we have some chat.
So there's some coming through Pathable and then some coming through the chat on here. One through Pathable asks, will you be sharing your presentation with this group?
I think so. I think it's being recorded here, right?
Yeah, and if there's a place, I'm not as familiar with Pathable as a platform, but if there's a place for us to upload the PowerPoint, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I think we can attach it to this.
We encourage, since there's such limited time for questions, for people to just email us at our general office email, and Stephanie or I will respond. Let's see, one of the questions, you say you were gathering data about what monographs you were not collecting. How in a general way, in 40 seconds, do you do that? Well, one thing is with copyright registration is the stuff's all coming in and then it's being selected. So there's a list of what came in the door and then what was retained. So you can just dedupe out of that and see what was excluded. With our approval plans, we have two types of approval plans. One you're more accustomed to, which we call vendor select, where the vendor just sends us stuff within the scoping document and it's pulled out of the acquisitions. It's just encumbered as it comes in and invoiced. And then we have what's called an LC select, where they send us a list of things that we're interested in and we choose from the list. So we could see what is the vendor offering us in the areas we say we're interested in, and what is being retained and what is not actually being sent. We also send a lot of stuff back. We're a tough customer.
Another question is, do you think, will you ever get to the point where you will be able to answer the question, how many books does the Library of Congress have by Black writers or similar?
God, I hope so.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a again, I am now speaking in an individual capacity and not necessarily representative of the Library of Congress or the government of the United States. But I will say this, there is an LC class, subclass, or subject heading for African American author. I understand why that is not necessarily affixed to works, because so much material is coming in that it's about, do you catalog it and get it in with an MLC record, with a minimal level cataloging record, or do you do the subject analysis and add in the more descriptive subject headings to help with intellectual access? Record enhancement is something we talk about a lot at the library, and I think it is challenging if we have to think to know what African American authors we have in our collection. We have to go to a list produced by somebody outside the organization to do that. But that is something Stephanie and I want to do. We want to do it for other groups. We want to do it for other communities. I think it's an important thing to be done.
Will you release your findings once the project is done? Will you provide recommendations for other libraries that might want to emulate this?
So that's a great question. I think, we're presenting here, we're talking about it here at a conference. A lot of the reporting and conversations will begin with the Library of Congress first. And in terms of publishing in the library scholarly works, we're not sure about that yet.
I think, as far as this was a method at which we looked at the collection, I can see that coming forward. It's a challenge for us because, again, part of our selection criteria is about, we have all this material coming in, and there's sort of a triage process. There isn't as much as in other institutions seeking out through purchase. So we have a challenge there in kind of being on the same level as far as how obviously we can definitely explain, we had a big spreadsheet, we used these functions, we used access in this way, here are the queries we used. But in terms of teasing out stuff about the collection, there is a little bit of a uniqueness to the Library of Congress that won't always translate. So I hope so.
And it looks like there's just 2 more questions left. Who are your peers? How do you get their data for comparison?
That's a great question. I think in some cases, like, you think about other national libraries, but comparing a national collection against another national collection is going to have some big differences in terms of what is domestically published in the given national library's country. We have kind of discussed this a bit, and we're thinking kind of large research institutions. We've had a conversation or 2 with research libraries at universities. So I think kind of those 2 buckets are the areas we're thinking of. And, getting data, we don't really have an in-house or commercially available tool to get that. So it may be a situation where we are asking for help, honestly, with that data.
Yeah, I would add that the challenge is why it's hard for us is that other national libraries generally just collect comprehensively within their countries. If they do collect material that is outside of it, it's usually related to their colonial heritage, their colonial past, and we don't have that. We were a colony, and so we're more focused on broad areas of the world that, since America is always involved in something overseas. Again, my own personal reflection, not reflection of the government of the United States. yeah, the academic community is going to be a great comparable. You know, Harvard, Yale, UCLA, Stanford, and elsewhere in the international universities as well.
And I think that could change by subject area as well, depending on, as we're going through the different collections policy statements, what the given subject is at a given time.
Yeah, definitely. Since this is a subject-based analysis, this is how we've disaggregated the 23 million items. We'll kind of try to figure out, well, who are the libraries that actively collect in this discipline. You know, it could be NYPL as an example.
And then the last question is, are you including indigenous works in the diversity of your collections?
Yes.
Yes.
I would say that the library is very, as again, we are a government entity, we're very sensitive to our relationships with the indigenous communities in the US. I know a colleague of mine in the law library who created a web archiving collection around materials dealing with legal materials dealing with the various indigenous tribes. And so it is an area where we want to have a good collection as part of a national collection. Any other thoughts, comments, concerns? Well, thank you all for staying and asking some nice questions.
Yes, yeah, thanks for sticking around for another few minutes.
And again, if you have anything you want to talk to us about your own institution or collecting or what we're doing, we're happy to talk about it further. CDO@loc.gov.